This is a podcast from the South China Morning Post.
Scientists say it's not a question of if there will be a second wave of coronavirus, but a question of when.
This warning from the director of the CDC, a second wave of the coronavirus outbreak in the fall could be even more difficult.
But now it fears a new wave of infections.
That has got people worried about the possibility of a second wave of infections, especially...
Right, Doc, here we go. Second wave of infections, inevitable as we reopen.
It's now 2 months since the World Health Organization declared the coronavirus to be a pandemic. There are more than 4 million confirmed cases of COVID-19 worldwide. And by the time you hear my voice, more than 300,000 people will be confirmed dead around the world. In the United States, COVID-19 is now the #1 cause of death. After registering the highest number of infections and deaths in the US, New York is extending its lockdown beyond the month of May into June. Some cities in Europe are also ending their lockdowns. Germany and Spain are cautiously reopening bars and restaurants, and Italy's cafes, museums, and culture sites are allowing limited visitors. But while people are connecting like never before on video calls with Zoom, Skype, and FaceTime, the leaders and diplomats of the United States and China have never seemed so apart.
China is accusing the U.S. of pushing false information about the coronavirus origins.
The U.S. has once again pointed its finger at China,
accusing the U.S. military of bringing the virus to Wuhan.
President Trump discussing an unsubstantiated theory that the coronavirus outbreak began in a laboratory in Wuhan, China.
Meanwhile, in mainland China, in Hong Kong, and in countries across Southeast Asia, the fear of doctors, scientists, and governments trying to manage this pandemic is starting to come true. New infections are being reported. After flattening the curve of infections, Singapore and South Korea have reported new outbreaks. After 3 weeks of no new cases, Hong Kong has reported 2 new local infections. And since our last podcast, the city of Wuhan in central China, which had reopened after 76 days in lockdown, has also reported new infections. And there are reports of new infections in the northeast Chinese provinces of Heilongjiang, Jilin, and Liaoning. The global threat has moved to its next phase. You're listening to the Inside China podcast from the offices of the South China Morning Post here in Hong Kong. It's almost 4 months since we packed our laptops and began working from home. Now we are back in the office, and it's a slightly different place to work. Everyone in our newsroom now must wear masks. All have to fill out a daily health declaration. Editorial meetings are still being held online. And staff who have coughs, colds, fevers, or whose family members have recently flown in from overseas are asked to stay at home for a mandatory 2-week period. Welcome to a podcast from the new pandemic workplace.
My name is Mimi Lau.
And my name is Kinling Lo.
In this podcast, you will hear from the microbiologist who isolated the SARS virus, who's working with the team at Hong Kong University School of Public Health.
We are not seeing the full iceberg of the infection, right? We are only seeing the top of the iceberg.
He is going to tell us about the mutation of the coronavirus and what that means for any vaccine being developed.
This mutation is helping the virus to be more fit to transmit. This may actually be a signature of a more transmissible virus.
And despite the headlines about a US-China blame game, he's got good news about the global effort to crack the code on this virus.
The scientific collaboration has been excellent. That has been one of the, I suppose, positive things in the background of a lot of problems that we have at the moment.
Our colleague Mai Jun is going to give you the background on a new breed of Chinese diplomat, what some people are calling the wolf warriors.
Personally, I understand it as a new generation of diplomats.
He's going to tell you where they come from and how the rhetoric of Donald Trump and his staff is being used by Beijing to fill a new era of nationalism in China.
I think the public sentiment have changed significantly in China in the past 2 months. First, I think in the very beginning of the pandemic, everybody was just frustrated and they were angry about how the Chinese government handled this.
And in this episode, we're going beyond the anti-vaxxers, the conspiracy theories, and the false information to speak to a man who's using artificial intelligence to measure the full extent of how the pandemic is affecting our emotions and the kinds of things we are posting online.
So what we're seeing is fear. A nuanced form of fear is intimidation. So there's a sense of intimidation. There's a small amount of panic. There's definitely anxiety. There's a seed bed of emotion here which can absolutely be amplified.
But first, let's hear from this man.
I'm Malik Pieris. I'm a professor in virology at the School of Public Health, the University of Hong Kong.
Professor Malik Pieris is a microbiologist and pathologist on a team at the Hong Kong University School of Public Health. Back in 2003, his lab team was the first to isolate the SARS virus and then developed a rapid diagnostic test to detect it. And now he's figuring out what happens when the coronavirus starts mutating.
So coronaviruses are RNA viruses, and as such, they do undergo mutation. But coronaviruses mutate much less than, say, for example, influenza viruses. But up to now, most of the mutations have not been particularly functionally important, meaning although there have been previous claims of the virus mutating in association with increased disease severity and things like that, really there is no strong evidence to support that. But the virus mutations have been useful to allow us to track where a particular virus is going. So, for example, from which part of the world did the virus get to New York, for example? That type of information has been useful. And also at a smaller scale, when you have small outbreaks, then again, sequencing and mutations or lack of mutations helps you to track virus transmitting from one person to another. But quite recently, there was a paper from the group at Los Alamos in the USA where they looked at the total virus sequence information from GISAID, a public accessible database, and they noticed one particular mutation in the spike of the virus, which is the part that binds to the receptor on the cell, a mutation that is becoming more and more common, more and more dominant in multiple parts of the world. So they are postulating that this mutation is helping the virus to be more fit to transmit. And this may actually be a signature of a more transmissible virus, but not associated with change in severity, but increased transmissibility. And that does look reasonable and plausible, so it's something obviously we need to keep an eye open for, but it doesn't really change in any fundamental way the way we respond to the virus at the moment.
Is it right that even if a mutation is going on, it doesn't really change the development of a vaccine?
The mutations that we have seen so far do not make any significant changes to the development of a vaccine. And also what we know about coronaviruses in the past, such as the SARS of 2003 and also the MERS more recently, suggests that even though the virus undergoes mutation, they don't change significantly at the key site that is important for the virus to bind to the cell, and that is the important site by which antibodies bind to the virus to neutralize the virus. So on the basis of those previous experience, we don't think that the virus is going to mutate away from antibody pressure or vaccine pressure. Of course, it's left to be seen, but I think most of us are quite confident that you won't have the same problems we have with influenza, for example.
If we're seeing a more dominant sequence of this virus, and if it is actually more transmissible among human beings, does that mean we are in a bigger trouble?
Well, I think we are in trouble already, so I don't think it's really changing very dramatically the nature of the trouble. And anyway, I mean, what this group is reporting is something that has already happened. So now this virus is the one that is dominant in many parts of the world.
Can we take a look at the situation in Hong Kong? So I understand that you have been calling for a large-scale antibody study to be done in order to find out actually how many people in Hong Kong were ever infected of the coronavirus. Can you take us through why that is important to Hong Kong?
In order to try to understand exactly how many people have been infected with the virus, this is a question that is important for a number of reasons. It is particularly important with this virus because we know that quite a significant proportion of infections are asymptomatic. So why is it important to know? The first reason is that at the moment we are looking at the so-called severity of the disease and calculating, what is called the case fatality based on the number of cases reported or confirmed. And then looking at the number of patients who died and dividing that by the total number of cases that are confirmed. But obviously, the cases that are confirmed are only those that come to medical attention. And then even in some cases, even patients who come to medical attention are not tested because of lack of capacity to test. So in other words, we are not seeing the full iceberg of the infection. Right? We are only seeing the top of the iceberg,
right,
the bit above the water, if you like. So the only way to see the whole iceberg is to actually do antibody testing, because antibody is a marker of, past infection. And if you see somebody who has antibody and that is specific to the virus, one can conclude that these people have been infected in the past. So then if the iceberg in total is much bigger than we think it is, then one can conclude that the severity of the disease is less than we think it is. So that is one important issue to understand, to really calculate the severity of the disease. So we did this type of work during the 2009 pandemic, and we were clearly able to show that the severity of the 2009 pandemic was much lower than what was believed, before these antibody test studies were done. There's another important reason to know what is the immunity in the population, because we know that the only way that this outbreak will naturally come under control is when enough people in the population have antibody to this virus that is protecting them from reinfection. Now, the only ways you can get this type of protection is either by natural infection or by immunization or vaccine. And we also know, based on the transmissibility of the virus, that roughly about 50 to 60% of the population would have to be immune to naturally bring this outbreak under control. So it is important to know where we are in regard to this natural immunity. This is what is called herd immunity, in some circles. So these are the two important reasons. And then, of course, there are other important questions to address. So, for example, when somebody gets infected, do they all make antibody? Are all these antibodies protective antibodies? How long do these protective antibodies last? So these are all also extremely important questions for the overall control of the outbreak, and also to understand how vaccines might work as well. So these are all important questions to try to address. So this is why we have argued for population-based testing for antibody. We did, as I said, exactly this type of study with the 2009 pandemic very successfully, and we hope to do that again. And we are happy that the government is looking into, the Hong Kong government is looking into supporting our work.
I'm actually always confused about a point. When we talk about the antibody developed in a person who was infected of the coronavirus, does it mean that they are immune to this virus ever in the future? For sure?
So this is, with many virus infections, this is the case. But for this particular coronavirus, we are not completely sure, so there would have to be some additional studies done to prove that as well.
Now, one major part of the news narrative about the coronavirus is the political battle between the US and China. But the story that hasn't really made headlines is how the University of Hong Kong is playing a crucial role both in leading the research and bringing the global scientific community together to fight the pandemic. So I had to ask the professor, how does he feel reading these headlines where politicians and diplomats are making threats about who is to blame and who's going to pay for this pandemic?
Well, I mean, as a scientist, I find the sort of geopolitical competition and if you like, finger pointing extremely disappointing, because what we have is a virus. So that is the challenge that we have to deal with. I mean, if we are trying to argue, between different groups or different peoples or different countries, that is really not going to take us forward. And I think it is very important to understand that this pandemic is not going to be controlled in any one country or any one region. As long as the outbreak or the pandemic is spread.
Mai Jun is one of our colleagues on the China desk in Beijing Bureau who has been to Wuhan to report on the opening up of the city from lockdown. And he has also been covering the increasingly aggressive tone by the Chinese diplomats who have been labeled as the wolf warriors.
Do you think people outside of China have seen that movie?
Probably not. But if you want a quick explanation of the background to wolf warrior diplomats, there's a blockbuster action movie from 2015 called Wolf Warrior. It's about a PLA Special Force soldier who has to hunt down an evil drug lord and his mercenary army. Here's a cut from the trailer.
把命送在了中国，不要小看中国。我没有杀人。You are under arrest. When they meet me, then they'll know what they're up against.
So if you're American, think of a Chinese version of a Chuck Norris movie like Delta Force.
Here's what Mai Jun has to say about that background.
This term is actually from a movie dated back in 2015, some action movie that told the story of a retired Chinese soldier, defending Chinese citizens and fighting terrorism overseas. But in recent years, I think this phrase is mainly used to describe ultra-nationalistic and ultra-hawkish Chinese diplomats who were maybe becoming more than necessarily aggressive when dealing with diplomats from other countries and when defending Chinese interests abroad. We've seen these phrases more often this year, but actually I think this goes back much further and really shows how much more aggressive and assertive China is, and how much more aggressive it has been dealing with the other countries and dealing with international disputes. Personally, I understand it as a new generation of diplomats who were recently promoted to their current post right now, as well as a generation of diplomats that are slightly older but have grown much more aggressive in recent years after China's grand strategy has changed.
Can you give us an example how this has been particularly prevalent in recent context?
One of the earlier example I could recall is actually from before even the movie was screened. I remember that was from roughly 2014 or 2015. That was a Chinese ambassador to the United Kingdom, Liu Xiaoming, who was speaking on a television show and then described the militarism of Japan as a Voldemort in UK. I personally think that was that shows how aggressively these diplomats were trying to defend the image of China after the outbreak of the global pandemic this year. These kind of sporadic cases of ultra-nationalistic attacks launched by Chinese diplomats have become a much broader trend.
Right, so we've just talked about how China has breeded a new generation of these wolf warrior diplomats, but then the Chinese ambassador to US, Cui Tiankai, seems to be of another kind, and he just spoke on CCTV this week. Can you take us through why the appearance of Cui Tiankai and what he talked about on TV was of any importance? to the US and China relations now?
So the Chinese ambassador Cui Tiankai appeared on Chinese national TV, CCTV, and spoke on the coronavirus. So his style was actually a little bit different from the warrior wolf style. Basically, his main points were, first of all, this is the origin of the pandemic is a question of science, and we should let scientists to decide. And any speculation or any attempt to politicize the issue is not appropriate. And of course, he called out U.S. politicians who were making the claims that the virus was leaked from a lab in Wuhan, and he said the U.S. should stop the blame game. So what we're seeing here is actually Ambassador Cui doing what he's been trying to do in the past a month or two. He's trying to be, well, I wouldn't say the lone, but one of the fewer reasonable and restrained voices from the Chinese diplomatic community. And he's actually been saying the same things to the US media in the past month. What I think is special about the interview he did on CCTV was he was speaking to domestic audience, and he had said the same thing to the U.S. media before. What is very interesting at that point, which is I think it was about a month ago when he spoke to U.S. media and said this is an issue of science, and we politicians should shut up and just leave it to the scientists. What was special about that was after Trump publicly called the virus a Chinese virus. So I think there were efforts within the diplomatic community of both sides trying to bring down the tension. But I would say it's a completely different question whether those efforts will actually work.
Can we just shift our focus to what we reported this week on a 57-page document being circulated by the American Republican Party, a guide to how they will campaign for the 2020 U.S. election. And it's basically a blame China plan. What was the response on Chinese social media? Can you tell us about that?
The Chinese social media basically reacted very fiercely. The average China internet users find it very appalling that U.S. politicians are using these kind of tactics to try to win votes. To be honest, I think if we look at the broader picture of how, say, senior U.S. officials were talking and how those people out in the public are already behaving, we probably wouldn't find this document very surprising, because I think it's very difficult. I think even the Republicans candidates realized that it was very difficult to defend how Trump performed in the initial stage of the pandemic. So to deflect that blame, they had to blame China.
How does that serve the CCP? Do you see that sort of intensify the current nationalistic sentiment already boiling inside China?
Yes, definitely. I think the public sentiment have changed significantly in China in the past 2 months. First, I think in the very beginning of the pandemic, everybody was just frustrated and they were angry about how the Chinese government handled this. They were angry about the same things that U.S. politicians are angry about. They are angry about how whistleblowers like Dr. Li Wenliang were silenced and all that. But I think after the pandemic was gradually brought under control in China, and of course the Chinese government, they have all these tools of information, so they try to redirect the discussions and focus them on the accusations from the U.S. and how Western countries are having difficulties dealing with the pandemic, and that really helped the Chinese government to actually look better when compared to their counterparts. I think I mentioned it in my story, which I filed from Wuhan. When I talked to people in Wuhan, I was shocked to find that many of them actually believe that the origin of the coronavirus was actually from U.S. soldiers who traveled to the city for the international military games.
Did he really just say some people in Wuhan think coronavirus came from American soldiers?
He really did. You couldn't get a clearer example of how the infodemic of conspiracy theories has gone worldwide.
I mean, it doesn't match up. The evidence is pointing against what she's saying.
It's called playbook.
Plandemic, a 25-minute video claiming to show the real story behind COVID-19.
Now we're not going to talk to you about the so-called documentary that's been banned by YouTube and Facebook. It's a kind of thing that Dr. Joan Donovan warned about on our previous podcast.
Right now, we're at another crossroads where monitoring fake news isn't going to be enough. We are seeing manipulation on the level we have never seen it before. We are seeing new tactics. We are working night and day to figure out what these techniques are.
We found someone who's going beyond the Facebook feed to find out what people are thinking right now.
My name's John Ricketts. I'm the CEO of a company called Significant Systems.
John has been developing web applications since the mid-1990s. In fact, back in 1994, he and his team predicted the future of the World Wide Web as including something called social media. And this is what they have built.
So Earth AI is a platform that does a number of things. Most importantly, what it does is that it understands that everybody lives in media bubbles these days. So what Earth AI can do is look through a media bubble, to look on the other side of a media bubble, to actually look at what the reality of the situation looks like. And then we can start to analyze that reality. And a lot of what we look at is the narrative, and it understands that emotions drive behavior. So what is the emotion around that narrative?
What exactly does looking through a media bubble mean? And how does that work exactly?
So what we have with the internet, and we look at the whole open web, so we're very much looking at the open domain. That's a pretty good map of the way things actually are, if only we could understand the world in that way, right? Again, what you don't want to do is to fall into one of these media bubbles where you're only looking at what's happening on Twitter and deciding that's an accurate map of reality. It isn't. Or you look in your Facebook feed and decide that your Facebook feed is an accurate map of reality. It isn't. It's what you've been served up because there's a business model behind that. So what we're doing is that we're looking at open data in a pretty similar way that Google is able to rank according to authority. What we will do is look at long-term engagement, and then through looking at long-term engagement, we throw a lot of decision-making science on top of that. We throw a lot of AI on top of that, and we start to form a view.
What this means is John and his team are using an AI system to measure every single thing published to the open web about a particular subject, and this is what he has been finding lately.
One of the things we've been looking at is, of course, the emotions around COVID-19 in the UK. What we've seen is, it's been pretty stark. I mean, there's been a big increase around grief and despair recently. Hope comes back in waves, but at least a week ago, it had pretty much evaporated. I think there is a little bit more optimism around now. It's pretty useful that we have an understanding of where we are as a society. Yeah, I mean, how are we all feeling about this? Is actually a quite important question.
So that's what people are thinking about in the UK. We asked John to get this Earth AI system to measure what people in the United States are thinking about China.
Yeah, so what's interesting is to have a look at China from a US perspective. So what are the emotions surrounding China? Obviously, we can drill down into a lot of specific details, but even at this top level, what we see is the dominant emotion is fear. And of course, that's going to dovetail beautifully with a pillar of a Trump campaign, right?
Now, keep in mind that this was before the revelations that the Trump campaign has a 57-page plan to blame China for coronavirus as the focus of his 2020 presidential re-election campaign.
So what we're seeing is fear. A nuanced form of fear is intimidation. So there's a sense of intimidation. There's a small amount of panic. There's definitely anxiety. There's a seed bed of emotion here which can absolutely be amplified.
This research John Ricketts and his team are doing with Earth AI is revealing something deeper about the impact of social media on how we think. In Mandarin Chinese, we call it 享乐主义.
Hedonism. People basically do things that they like doing, right? So it's an old observation, but it's a fun one. Hedonism comes in lots of different forms, yeah? So it's important to realize that when you go, I don't suppose many people have been to a wrestling match, but if you go to a wrestling match, everybody who's booing the baddie is having a good time. They may look on the outside, they look really angry and they've got, but they are absolutely having a great, fantastic time. So it's hedonic, it's fun. And if it wasn't fun, they wouldn't do it. So what we were able to do is to look at a lot of the aspects around a lot of disinformation campaigns, et cetera, that go out there on social media. I mean, it's awash with things, isn't it? One of the recent ones has been COVID-19 and 5G, which has really got a lot of traction in a lot of places. Now, a lot of the commentary I see tends to be focused on things like, well, this is malicious disinformation, this is Russian bots, et cetera. That could all well be true, but the fact of the matter is that for a campaign such as this to get anywhere, it has to connect with people in a meaningful way, and they have to want to play along with the game. What we can see is that if we have a look at how that narrative around COVID-19 and 5G is perceived and understood in different places. So, for instance, we can look at Singapore. Singapore, absolutely toxic, right? Anybody who entertains this horrible, malicious, damaging narrative is a crazy person. You wouldn't go near it. We look in Australia, there's a definitely fun element of this here. So there is a sense of belonging, there's fun, there's involvement. And so that's quite surprising at first, but then you get a little bit brutally honest with yourself. And I don't know about you, but I certainly remember being in my sort of late teens and early 20s, and you start to open your mind around the world around you when you come across interesting ideas or conspiracy theories, depending on what side of the bed you could get out of that day. And there was absolutely a sense of them being fun. They boosted your social status. It was a way of connecting with people. There was a lot that was hedonic around it, and that's what we're very much seeing around this. So, at the end of the day, things work because of people. So you need to very, very much look at the psychology around why things spread and what it actually means to people.
So we're faced with these increasingly good and evil aspects of social media being amplified in this pandemic. On one hand, we're seeing social media bringing people together around the world to talk on video chat, have virtual cocktail parties, to see and hear our favorite musicians make music and talk to us from their homes in lockdown.
And on the other hand, we are seeing people retreating from the reality and going to a much darker place.
That's all from us for this week's episode of Inside China.
Don't forget to stay up to date with our 24-hour coverage on scmp.com. And once again, thanks for your emails, your tweets, and your podcast reviews and ratings. I'm Mimi Lau. Until next time, stay in touch, but keep your distance.
And I am Kinling Lo. Wash your hands and stay safe.